Hello, time for another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is Confederate Cavalryman versus Union Cavalryman, Eastern Theater, 1861-1865 by Ron Field. This book was published in 2015 by Osprey Publishing. It's 80 pages long. In the early days, the opening days of the American Civil War, the Confederate Army had staged a number of spectacular victories. They had a whole series of battles in which the Union forces were routed. And a big part of that was a big part of the success of the Confederate Army was the success of the superiority of their cavalry. The Confederate cavalry in the early days of the war is far superior to those of the Union forces. And as this book points out, largely that was due to the fact that the South was a horse culture. Almost every adult male knew how to ride. They not only knew how to ride, but the officers, the generals, and the commanders had an instinctive idea of how to use the cavalry most successfully, both in battle and as reconnaissance forces. And so in the early days, when the two cavalry forces met, it was almost always a rout in favor of the Confederate forces. But the Union forces were quick learners. They figured out what they were doing wrong, and over time, as the war dragged on, the Federal cavalry forces got stronger. They had better equipment, more horses, more men, and as they grew in experience, they began to surpass the Confederate cavalry in quality. And by the end of the war, the Confederate cavalry was in severe decline. They'd lost a lot of men, they'd lost a lot of horses, they were having trouble replacing people. Some of their best commanders had been killed or captured, and so the tide turned. By 1864, the tide turned in favor of the Federal cavalry forces. Now, this book points out or shows how this evolution of the Federal cavalry developed by looking closely at three cavalry battles. The first one was Lewis Ford, which was part of the larger Second Battle of Bull Run on August 30th, 1862, and then the Battle of Buckland Mills on October 19th, 1863, a battle that occurred just 3 months after the Battle of Gettysburg, and then finally in the Shenandoah Valley, the Battle of Tom's Brook on October 9th, 1864. The first two battles were huge victories for the Confederates, the last one a huge victory for the Federal forces. Lewis Ford was a part of, as I said, a larger part of the larger Second Battle of Bull Run. The forces led by Confederate Beverly Robertson charged the Union forces led by John Buford. Buford's forces broke. They managed to smash through the Federal defenses, and it led to a complete rout where the whole Federal troops were running like crazy back to Washington, D.C. It was a huge victory for the Confederates early in the war. Now, if we skip ahead to Buckland Mills, this occurred, as I said, just a few months after the Battle of Gettysburg. It's often said that the Battle of Gettysburg was the turning point of the Civil War, and in some sense that's true, but the Confederates still had a number of major victories following the disaster at Gettysburg, and one of them was the Battle of Buckland Mills, which became known among Confederates as the Buckland Races. What happened was the Federal forces under Justin Kilpatrick were lured into a trap and were counterattacked. The forces of J.B. Stuart, the great Confederate cavalry officer general, were retreating, but they lured them into a trap, and they were cut off from the outside forces. And when Stuart attacked, they broke and took off running, and riding the horses and fleeing for 5 miles back to Union forces. And Stuart called this the Buckland Races because they were racing to try to get away. It was a huge humiliation. One of the cavalry officers involved was General George Armstrong Custer. He was humiliated. Not only did his forces retreat pell-mell, but Custer lost his flag, his battle flag, and his headquarter wagon was captured by the Confederates. So it was Custer's worst defeat prior to his destruction at the Battle of Little Bighorn years later. But as I said, as time went on, the Confederate cavalry began to deteriorate over time as the War of Attrition drug on. And the final battle in the book is Tom's Brook, which took place again in 1864 in the Shenandoah Valley. The Union cavalry general Phil Sheridan was conducting a scorched earth policy much like General Sherman was doing in Georgia, burning barns, destroying railroad lines, and capturing livestock and carrying them away. And it was infuriating the people in the Shenandoah Valley, and the Confederate forces under Jubal Early were told to go try to confront them. And so the two forces under Early and Sheridan met on October 9th, and the result was a huge defeat for the Confederate cavalry. They took off running, racing back to the small town of Woodstock, and Sheridan and his forces Custer was involved in this, so he got his revenge there. He called it the Woodstock races because they raced 20 miles back to their headquarters at Woodstock, and so it was a big victory. And so this kind of epitomized the change of fortune, the reversal of fortune, where the federal forces, the federal cavalry, was now superior. This book also goes on to describe how the strategies of the two armies, the types of horses they had, the uniforms, the weapons, the way they were arranged, and the tactics they were involved. So if you're interested at all in the history of the Civil War, and you're particularly interested in cavalry actions and the involvement of horses in the warfare, this is a really interesting book. It's only 80 pages, so it's a quick read, and it's highly illustrated. There are maps, there are color paintings, and black and white photographs from the time as well. So it's a good book if you're a Civil War buff. It's called Confederate Cavalryman versus Union Cavalryman. The author is Ron Field. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.